Welcome to the School of Optometry. Welcome to the University of Waterloo. My name is Paul Murphy. I'm the Director of the School of Optometry and Vision Science, and it's extra special for us to welcome you all here this evening. My job is really just to get things started and to introduce to you our Pascal lecture program. And of course that has brought you all here today. If you were here last night, you would have already heard an excellent first lecture, and we're looking forward to another one this evening. The Pascal lectures are a unique and special thing, I would say, for the University of Waterloo. It's not often that universities can have this format of presentation, but it very much falls within the ancient tradition of universities to stimulate open discussion and consideration of all sorts of topics. And the topics that we're looking at around Christianity and the university are very relevant and are, I hope, stimulating today as it was yesterday. Just to remind you of some thought around what the lectures are for, you've all hopefully received this leaflet as you came in, but Blaise Pascal, after whom the lectures are named, was a 17th century French academic and Christian. He's remembered today as a forerunner of Newton in the establishment of calculus and as the author of his Christian meditation, Les Pensées. Members of the University of Waterloo, wishing to establish a forum for the presentation of Christian issues in an academic environment, have chosen to commemorate the spirit of Pascal by an annual event, the Pascal Lectures on Christianity and the University. The Pascal lectures bring to the University of Waterloo outstanding individuals of international repute who have distinguished themselves in both an area of scholarly endeavour and an area of Christian thought or life. These individuals discourse with the university community on some aspect of its own world, its theories, its research, its leadership role in society, challenging the university to a search for truth through personal faith and intellectual inquiry, which focus on Jesus Christ. So welcome to the school, welcome to the university, and welcome this evening.
Thanks, Dr. Murphy. And now it's my pleasure in a few moments to introduce our speaker tonight. First of all, I want to welcome you, whether you're here in this auditorium, in one of our overflow rooms, or listening to us by video. The program notes indicate that our distinguished speaker, Dr. John Lennox, holds a PhD from Cambridge, a Doctor of Science degree from the University of Wales in Cardiff, and a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford. John speaks English, Russian, French, German, and Spanish. He's a professor of mathematics at Oxford, fellow of mathematics in the philosophy of science, and pastoral advisor at Green Templeton College, Oxford, adjunct professor at Wycliffe Hall, and senior fellow of the Trinity Forum. He's very interested in the interface between science, philosophy, and theology, and his books on those topics have garnered much interest. His heartwarming and insightful lectures have made him a highly desired international speaker. My name is Wayne Broadland, and I'm one of the members of the Pascal Committee. I've really enjoyed getting to know Dr. Lennox over the last few days. I picked him up in Toronto, and on the way back, I was so engaged with what he was saying that I completely missed my turnoff to come up into this area. The Pascal Committee has given Dr. Lennox a very heavy schedule with 2 lectures, a seminar, and numerous lunch and dinner meetings. And so the other night, as some of us committee members were sitting around with him present, I couldn't help but remember a title of one of his math books. It's called Subnormal Subgroups of Groups, and I was wondering what on earth he was thinking about us. Although the mathematical subject of groups is very near and dear to mathematicians' heart, I will try not to explain anything more about it tonight. And John, maybe it's just as well if you didn't tonight either. On a more serious note, mathematics has much to do with clear thinking and finding simple and elegant solutions to complex and challenging problems. The beauty of that mathematical approach was in evidence last evening as Dr. Lennox addressed the relationship between science and God. He managed to extricate that topic from the mud where it often gets stuck, wash it off, and point out some fascinating connections between God and science that otherwise might have gone unnoticed. Dr. Lennox has been sharing freely of himself and of his knowledge while he has been here at Waterloo. In his gospel, Matthew writes, "Therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a master of a house who brings out of his treasure that which is new and that which is old." And that's exactly what Dr. Lennox has been doing. This evening, a number of Dr. Lennox's books are available for sale in the foyer. And following the lecture, he will take questions texted to the phone number that you'll see on the screen. If you would like to contribute financially to the Pascal lectures or speak to one of the members of the Pascal committee, you'll find information on the back of this evening's program. I'm very pleased and much looking forward to this evening's lecture on the problem of evil. And I hope you will join me in welcoming Dr. John Lennox.
Well, thank you very much for that warm introduction. It's very humiliating and humbling, you know, when you write a book on mathematics and called subnormal subgroups of groups and it gets classified in the library under abnormal psychology. It has been a great honor and a pleasure to be with you in this university, whose maths department I've known for many years and been here lecturing. And it's delightful to see in the 21st century that we have things like the Pascal lectures. They, of course, would be nothing uncommon many years back. My own University of Oxford still carries the motto, Dominus illuminatio mea, the Lord is my illumination. Because, of course, the people that founded our great universities, both in Britain and in North America, did not see any tension between faith in God and the intellectual disciplines of the natural sciences, literature, and everything else. And theology took its place among them, often regarded actually as the queen of the sciences. And so we're getting back to the spirit of the university itself, as our chairman indicated. As usual, you have set me the hardest problem. And I mean it's the hardest problem. Pascal saw it, of course, and gave it his own twist. But the problem of pain and evil and suffering is something that affects us all, quite irrespective of our worldview, whether we're believers or not. And it's a very sensitive question. And we are rightly very suspicious of facile answers. And unfortunately, as Pascal indicates in the quote that stands on the top of the lecture, it's given a rather sad twist when religion itself gets blamed for creating the evil. And the quote that stands at the top of my lectures is, "Men never do evil so cheerfully as when they do it from religious convictions." And a cursory glance around the world today confirms that in every direction. So we're facing a very difficult question indeed, which, far from getting easier as the years go on, appears to get more difficult because the 20th century was the bloodiest century in history. I know that Steven Pinker is optimistic and he thinks that the sum total of evil is diminishing. I have unfortunately not yet been able to read his book, so I'll reserve judgment on that. But certainly all of us are aware of this difficult problem. And it's complicated by the fact that there are several angles to it. So I would like to just set up a way in which I found useful of getting into this question. I'm not going to offer you any simplistic solutions tonight, but I think there may be a way in that in my experience many people have found helpful upon reflecting on it. But let me state some pretty obvious things first of all. There are two perspectives. It's one thing to be a professor of oncology. It is another to be told you've 3 months to live because you've got pancreatic cancer. There's an outside story. There's the observation by people outside the suffering. And there's the actual pain of enduring the suffering. And of course, any response has got to cope with those two sides. There is an intellectual side as we observe it. Can we make sense of it? Can we get any clarity? Can we get any sense of direction in navigating? But how do we cope with it? Where will we get help? So there's, in a sense, a very real pastoral problem. And of course, one of my duties, which is unusual, I suppose, for a professor of Oxford at Oxford, is to be a pastoral advisor. And students and faculty members come and tell me of the things that are tearing their hearts to shreds and ripping them up. And any fair treatment of this topic must attempt to deal with both sides of it, or else it will be regarded as inadequate from the start. Intellectual clarity we'd all like to have, but it doesn't always penetrate a veil of tears. And how does one bring either clarity or hope into situations that are so devastating that they are irreversible? You can mend a broken leg, but not a lost child. You can't replace a dead wife or a dead husband. And the deep questions flow in unending stream. Why did that happen to them? Why did they get killed and I was spared? And as a lady said to me as she thought of the office in which she sat at Christchurch, New Zealand, when the earthquake came and it killed the lady beside her and the man beside her, and she was left. Why were they killed and why was I left? Or is that just sentimental irrationality? There is no hope. We have to face the brute fact, bury our dead, and move on. Now, the next thing from the theological perspective is that the Bible is aware of the problem at a very deep level. For instance, the New Testament relates a story how 3 friends of Jesus, Martha, her sister Mary, and her brother Lazarus, who lived in Bethany near Jerusalem, suddenly discovered that Lazarus was terminally ill. And Jesus was a long way away, and they thought, the sisters, that they should send an urgent message to Jesus about the state of Lazarus. And Jesus did not immediately respond, with the result that Lazarus died. And it hit the 2 women like an earthquake. Presumably he was the breadwinner and so on. And finally Jesus came. And when Mary saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying? And with that, the text opens up the most frequently asked question of all. Couldn't God have made a world so that it didn't damage people? Couldn't he have given us bodies that never went wrong? Couldn't he have made the sun so that it heated without burning? Couldn't he have made an earth whose tectonic plates didn't shift and cause devastating earthquakes? And so on and so forth. We shall have to face that anon. But if there are two perspectives on the question of suffering and pain, there are two logically distinct sources of evil, suffering, and pain, although in practice they're often intertwined. The first is the suffering and pain that human beings inflict on one another. This is usually called the problem of moral evil. And the second is the suffering and pain that are caused without human involvement, natural disasters like tsunamis, earthquakes, and diseases like brain tumors and cancer. And that is called technically the problem of pain, or the problem of natural evil. And to hold the two different sources in our minds, we might think of two cathedrals. Coventry Cathedral in England or Dresden Cathedral in Germany are potent symbols of what happens in wartime and is linked with moral evil. Christchurch Cathedral in New Zealand, it was devastated by an earthquake. And if you've ever visited either of the cathedrals, or both in my case, you will see two things. You will see immediate devastation. It's clear that a bomb has hit the one and an earthquake has hit the other, but also they exhibit traces of their former beauty. So what you get is a mixed picture. I call it beauty and barbed wire. And that's our problem. As we look at life, we are constantly impressed with this mixed picture. I look at Andromeda through my telescope, and its beauty is just spectacular. I look at television and I see ISIS beheading an innocent person. Beauty and bombs. Beauty and barbed wire. That reminds us immediately that there are unlikely to be any simplistic answers to these deep questions. Because the picture is not only ragged, it's raw for many people. It's actual. They're suffering it. There are families at this very moment wondering what's happening to their loved ones, and there are people facing execution in the most abominable of ways, or starvation, or terminal disease, as we enjoy the comfort of this lecture theatre. And I'm very sensitive to this. I want to be aware of that as I talk to you. So we look at those two things, and we see natural disaster and we see moral disaster. They are often connected, of course. One can lead to the other. Greedy deforestation can lead to the proliferation of desert, leading to malnutrition and disease. So a moral catastrophe leads to a natural catastrophe. And it is very interesting that the deepest and most ancient document perhaps that deals with the problem of evil, certainly in the biblical literature, is the very ancient book of Job. And you will notice that in it, the reasons for the devastation on Job's family come from both sources. Lightning falls in the house, and his children are killed. The Sabaeans come and massacre. So it's moral evil and natural evil. They're brought together in a very interesting way, so that the man was suffering from the impact of both of those things simultaneously. So we have the problem of pain, that's natural evil, and moral evil. So let's think of pain for a moment or two. Of course, at lower levels, the fact that we can sense pain is enormously important. It warns us of danger. So if we put our hand too near to a fire, our nervous system alerts the brain, and we experience a sensation of pain that leads to us pulling our hand back very rapidly. Some people do not have that sensation, and so they get burnt very easily, and they're vulnerable where we would not be. Next, a certain amount of pain is involved in development, for example, of people who play the English war game called rugby. And if my observations are anything to go by, seeing these heavily muscled young men, they're prepared to put up with an immense amount of pain to get to the top of the league and get their name in the Hall of Fame. At the next level, suffering and pain can contribute to character formation. Fyodor Dostoevsky once said that he could not imagine a great person who had not suffered. And we all know of cases of resilience and fortitude in the face of suffering that have molded character of great quality. Who cannot admire Stephen Hawking in his fight against motor neuron disease, or Joni Eareckson and the way she has coped with a lifetime of being a paraplegic? There's that side to it as well. And indeed, sometimes as parents we'll allow a child to go through a painful experience that we feel, we may be wrong of course, that will profit them in the end, and we hope that they'll profit from it. This might hurt you now, son, but you learn a lot from it. You know, that kind of thing. Now that's all very well, ladies and gentlemen. But of course, mounting in your minds will be the obvious objection to it. What about pain and evil that is so overwhelming that it is completely incommensurate with those kind of goals? C.S. Lewis is known for two very important books on these issues, The Problem of Pain and A Grief Observed. And he wrote a number of letters, and in one of them he says, it is so difficult to believe that the travail of all creation which God himself descended to share may be necessary in the process of turning finite creatures with free wills into gods. Yes, it is difficult to believe that earthquakes, famines, epidemics, Auschwitz, and the killing fields of Cambodia are necessary for that. So how do we react? Well, reactions will depend on our worldview. And indeed, many people's worldviews are formed substantially by reactions to these questions. Some react as theists, affirming faith in God in the words of Psalm 46 in the face of an earthquake. God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. Others react as pantheists, holding that those who suffer do so because of their sin in a previous existence. And this suffering helps them to work off their karma. Therefore, there's no real point in alleviating their pain, since that will only hinder the process of their purification and may turn them actually back in the cycle of karma. Yet others will say that earthquakes are a judgment of God. And indeed, in the case of the New Zealand earthquake, various religions suggested that that was the reason for the tsunamis. Yet others think that the obvious solution is atheism. That's true of many of my atheist friends. Their atheism or their agnosticism about God is a bit like Charles Darwin's. It had apparently very little to do with his biology, but it had a lot to do with the loss of a beloved daughter. Surely, people say, earthquakes, the existence of horrible diseases, the Holocaust, 9/11, show us that there is no God. And we'd be wiser simply to face the brute fact that that's the way the universe is, hard, unfeeling, caring nothing for whether we live or die. These issues have occupied the human mind for millennia. As the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher David Hume pointed out, referring to Greek philosophy of the 3rd century BC, he said, Epicurus's old questions are yet unanswered. Is he, God, willing to prevent evil but not able? Then is he impotent? Is he able but not willing? Then is he malevolent? Whence then this evil? And of course the questionings of Job and his friends are centuries older than Epicurus. But back to Pascal, first of all. The first reaction I listed was a theistic one, expressed in Hebrew poetry depicting faith in God in the face of earthquakes. But it will be at once objected that such people, though they may be firm in their faith in the face of earthquakes, in the face of natural evil, are surely forgetting that religion itself has been and still is one of the major causes of moral evil. Hence the Pascal quote. And of course, Bertrand Russell, like David Hume, took his cue from Epicurean philosophy, this time represented by the 1st century BC Latin poet Lucretius in his poem De Rerum Natura, that if you haven't read it, you should read it. It's fascinating. Bertrand Russell quotes this, and he says, "My view on religion is that of Lucretius. I regard it as a disease born of fear and as a source of untold misery to the human race." Here he echoes Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote in The Antichrist, "I condemn Christianity. I bring against the Christian church the most terrible of all the accusations that an accuser has ever had in his mouth. It is to me the greatest of all imaginable corruptions. It seeks to work the ultimate corruption, the worst possible corruption. The Christian church has left nothing untouched by its depravity. It has turned every value into worthlessness, and every truth into a lie, and every integrity into baseness of soul." And in our time, Richard Dawkins says, in an interview with the German cultural periodical Der Spiegel, that 9/11 radicalized him. And I quote, "My last vestige of hands-off religion respect disappeared in the smoke and choking dust of September 11, followed by the National Day of Prayer, when prelates and pastors did their tremulous Martin Luther King impersonation and urged people of mutually incompatible faiths to hold hands, united in homage to the very force that caused the problem in the first place." That's a brilliant piece of writing, and it contains the strong accusation. The logic's simple, of course. Imagine, with John Lennon, says Dawkins, a world without religion. Imagine no suicide bombers, no 9/11, no 7/7, no crusades, no witch hunts, no gunpowder plot, no Indian partition, no Israeli-Palestinian wars, no Serb-Croat Muslim massacres, no persecution of Jews as Christ killers, no Northern Ireland. What about Northern Ireland? No Northern Ireland, well. But that's not the end of the sentence. No Northern Ireland troubles. No honor killings. No shiny-suited, bouffon-haired televangelists fleecing gullible people of their money. God wants you to give till it hurts. Imagine no Taliban to blow up ancient statues, no public beheadings of blasphemers, no flogging of female skin for the crime of showing an inch of it. That message is powerful, you know. And it resonates in a world rendered fearful by fanatical acts of terror perpetrated by extremists. Which of us, apart from the terrorists themselves, would not like a world purged of such horrors? And I have no hesitation in agreeing with the new atheists on this issue that there are major problems with aspects of religion. How could we respect religious extremists that encourage young men and women to become living bombs in order to gain instant access to paradise? Pascal was clearly aware of the problem, yet retained his faith in God. On a personal note, as a Northern Irishman, I am familiar with sectarian violence, where religion has been used to fan the flames of terrorism on both sides of a sectarian divide. And my family have experienced bombs, and my brother was nearly killed by a bomb and was damaged permanently, psychologically, by it for his life. And I'm often asked what I think about the Pascal question. So since it comes first in our list, I'm going to address it first. What do I think of what's happened in my country? Well, I'm ashamed of it, ladies and gentlemen. Utterly and thoroughly ashamed of it. I'm ashamed that the name of Christ was ever associated with an AK-47, or a bomb. But I need to explain to you why I'm ashamed of it. Because you see, people who engage in those activities and take up weapons to defend Christ or his message are not following him, they're disobeying him. Explicitly disobeying him. The name Christian means a follower of Jesus Christ, and that means obeying his commandments. And one of his commandments, at the time he was on earth, was an explicit prohibition of the use of force and violence to defend him and his message. Jesus had taught his followers not to hate their enemies, but to love them. And so when an armed crowd came with Judas to the Garden of Gethsemane to arrest him, and one of the disciples, Peter, who was rather untrained in swordsmanship and didn't understand what Christ had meant when he talked about a sword, he got one with him and he swung it wildly, and trying to behead the high priest's servant, he missed and chopped the man's ear off. Luke, the medical doctor, tells us that Christ replaced the ear. Now that relates to my talk at lunch on miracles. I'm not going to repeat why I believe that to be the case. But you'd be very dull of imagination if you couldn't see the message Christ was communicating. Let me say it. If anybody takes weapons to defend Christ or his message, the net effect is to cut the ears off people in a very big way. Many of my friends will understandably not hear a word of what I say about my Christian faith because their ears have been cut off. So I'm afraid I've had to go into the ear repair business. And that's a very difficult thing, to put the ears back on people so that they can hear. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot speak for other religions. It's perfectly right that they, in a university setting, should speak for themselves. I can only speak as a Christian, and I'm telling you, I'm ashamed of the reputation of, in some quarters and in some historical periods, of this kind of thing. Now, I want to say one more thing about it because it is so vitally important. There's a deep irony in it, but it's a tragic irony. You see, Christ was arrested and tried by Pilate, the Roman governor. And he was tried on a charge of fomenting political terrorism. And as I pointed out once to Christopher Hitchens, isn't it ironic, Christopher, that you're fighting against Jesus when he was accused of the very thing you're accusing Christianity of, fomenting terrorism and violence, and he was exonerated from it publicly? If you had read his teaching, you'd be on his side, not fighting against him. And the dialogue between Jesus and Pilate is one of the most significant on this topic, because Pilate was very concerned, is this Jesus a political threat in the terms of violent terrorism to Rome? So he said to him, are you a king? And Jesus said, yes, but not quite in the way you think. My kingdom is not of this world. And then he explained it. Otherwise, my servants would have been fighting, that is right now, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. My kingdom is not of this world. It doesn't involve physical fighting. No, what it does involve, he said, is this. To this end I was born, and to this end I came into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. And the famous reply of this soldier and politician was, what is truth? Perhaps he wasn't being cynical after all, and he went out and said, I declare the man innocent. Because Pilate was bright enough to see what you can see instantly when you think about it. The one thing you cannot do by violence is impose truth. Especially if it's truth about peace with God, forgiveness, eternal life, and healing, and health, and wholeness, and all the things Jesus came to bring. That's why it is utterly wrong to take up weapons to defend Christ, as has sometimes happened. It's very important, isn't it, that those of us who are Christian make very clear to the world our stance on this business, because it's utterly clear in the Gospels. So that is my immediate response to this. But we need to balance things up a little bit, because unfortunately, when it comes to some of our new atheist writers, they will point out, rightly so, the evil done by the Crusades and the Inquisition and all that kind of thing. There's no excuse for any of it, of course. But what they fail to see is to analyze the good done by Christianity. Now, this is a huge topic in its own right, but I came across a very interesting quote from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Niall Ferguson's recent book, Civilization. And it's a very interesting thing. Quote, one of the things we were asked to look into, this is a delegation that was sent to investigate the West, we were asked to look into what was accounted for the success, in fact, the preeminent eminence of the West all over the world. We studied everything we could from the historical, political, economic, and cultural perspective. At first, we thought it was because you had more powerful guns than we had. Then we thought it was because you had the best political system. Next, we focused on your economic system. But in the past 20 years, we have realized that the heart of your culture is Christianity. That is why the West became so powerful. The Christian moral foundation of social and cultural life was what made possible the emergence of capitalism and the successful transition to democratic politics. We don't have any doubt about this. And that's a fairly recent paper, and Dominic Lawson, who's one of our top journalists in the UK, says if this is the conclusion it has come to, maybe Europe needs to reconsider whether it mightn't be an idea to encourage rather than eradicate Christianity. But back to the problem of evil. I have deep sympathy with those whose personal experience of suffering leads them to reject God. I've got many Jewish friends. I've been to Auschwitz many times, and I have wept every time. And I can well recall several groups of people, but these two in particular, brilliant Israeli scientists whom I met in a European country, and they were telling me about their reading. And they'd come across a novel by the Israeli Nobel Prize winner for literature, Bashevis Singer, called The Slave. And across the table they just told me, we're very sorry to disappoint you, but Bashevis Singer in the book describes how at a certain period in history during a pogrom in Russia, living Jewish women and children were buried. And they just said the light went out. I could forgive God anything but not that. I understand that. And if we don't feel that, we're like stone, aren't we? These are very, very deep things indeed. Now, I want to try and analyze this at a couple of different levels, as briefly as I can, and it's going to be very inadequate because this is a huge topic, and the last thing I want to do is trivialize it in the eyes of any of you. Is the atheistic belief system, is my first question, the only possible reasonable reaction to this? And at the philosophical level, I would want to ask, if there is no God, where do the concepts of good and evil with which we judge these things come from? Dostoevsky, again, who's regarded as a prophet by many Russians, said, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. Now, he did not mean that atheists cannot behave. I pointed out last night, I say it again, and I mean it, that my atheist friends can and have put me to shame by the quality of their moral behavior. That is not what Dostoevsky was suggesting for a moment. What he was suggesting, that at the level of rationality, you cannot get an intellectual base for the concepts of good and evil if you reject God. Interestingly, Richard Dawkins agrees with that. At least he seems to half agree with it, because he writes in two different directions at once. The first direction is the logical consequence of his atheism. I quote, In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme nor reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect. If there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Now, on that view, the suicide bombers of 9/11, the architects of the killing fields, Stalin, Hitler, and Mao with their barbarism, are simply dancing to their DNA, as you would be if you cut up babies for fun. That is, of course, the end, as Richard says, of all morality. There is no good. There is no evil. But then it's very odd that he talks about the problem of evil and how evil God is in allowing certain things. You cannot have it both ways, ladies and gentlemen. And it's important for us to see that there's a doing of the splits within our culture, one because of philosophy and the logical consequences of this kind of atheism. The other is this, that Richard Dawkins finds in himself that he's a moral being like all the rest of us are. I believe, of course, that's because we're all made as moral beings in the image of God. And therefore he encourages us to fight against, rebel against the selfish genes. But that's a rather curious thing if we're completely determined by them, as many philosophers, not just Christian ones, have pointed out, because objection to evil presupposes a standard of good that's objectively real and independent of us, so that we expect others to agree with us when we condemn torture and 9/11 and so on. But if there is no transcendence, if there's no God, then how can there be such an objective standard of good? The so-called problem of moral evil or natural evil dissolves into the pitiless indifference of uncaring matter. And in his magisterial work, The Secular Age, Charles Taylor agrees. The modern age, more or less repudiating the idea of a divine lawgiver, has nevertheless tried to retain the ideas of moral right and wrong, not noticing that in casting God aside, they have also abolished the conditions of meaningfulness for moral right and wrong as well. Educated people do not need to be told, I'm not sure of that, however, that questions such as these have never been answered outside of religion. The irony is, of course, that the morality that Richard Dawkins uses, and I would use, to condemn 9/11 is to be found in the Bible itself. And Thomas Jefferson, not notably convinced of the truth of Christianity, recognized that connection when he said, God who gave us life gave us liberty. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God? And cultural observers have pointed the obvious out, that no secular morality was able to withstand Stalin, Hitler, or Mao, and it won't withstand religious fanaticism today. But I think, really, it was Friedrich Nietzsche who saw more clearly than anyone else the consequences of abandoning the biblical morality that lies at the heart of Western civilization. He predicted that the death of God would lead to a Darwinian imperative of expressing the will to power. The strong must eliminate the weak. The biblical prohibition, he wrote, "Thou shalt not kill," is a piece of naivety. Life itself recognizes no solidarity, no equal rights between the healthy and the degenerate parts of an organism. One must excise the latter or the whole will perish. And Nietzsche despised Christian morality as that of slaves, and pointed out that the death of God would mean the death of compassion, kindness, and forgiveness. When one gives up Christian belief, one therefore deprives oneself, he says, of the right to Christian morality. Christian morality is a command. Its origin is transcendental. It possesses truth only if God is truth. It stands or falls with the belief in God. Well, the fact is that there is morality. Indeed, absolute moral standards seem to exist, don't they? Some things, as Michael Roos says, are just wrong. I find it difficult to imagine that there'd be anyone in this room who would claim that torturing infants is right. And if we all agree on it, it looks as if it's a pretty absolute commentary that we are making. And the prominent ethicist and atheist, actually, J.L. Mackie, admitted this. He said, ethics constitute so odd a cluster of qualities and relations that they are most unlikely to have arisen in the ordinary course of events without an all-powerful God to create them. This is an atheist writing. If then there are such moral values, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. Thus we have, after all, a defensible argument from morality to the existence of a God. Well, now, that's a little bit of philosophy that we could examine further, but let's get down to the crunch. You see, removing God, in some people's minds, solves the problem. It does not, obviously, remove either the pain or the suffering. It could make it 10,000 times worse. And now we need to bring Pascal in again, but in the negative sense. Pascal abhorred, as I do, and we all do, evil done in the name of religion. I pointed out that what I had to say about Christianity, secondly, that Christianity has done a lot of good. But we would be unfair to the topic if we didn't ask the question, has atheism caused any suffering and pain? John Lennon's song, Imagine a World Without the Taliban, you all know it, it's a delightful tune. The words are awful, but it's a delightful tune. But you've noticed I'm not John Lennon, I'm John Lennox. I have written a song. It's called Imagine. I'm not going to sing it. Imagine a world without Stalin, Mao, or Pol Pot. What about that world? I read nothing about it in the writings of the new atheists. There's an imbalance somewhere. Now, we could follow that. If you've been, as I have many times, to Eastern Europe and Russia, you find it very sad what you read in some of the writings of people who ought to know better. Richard Dawkins writing, I can't imagine an atheist who would bulldoze a cathedral like Chartres Notre Dame. And Richard Schröder, who's very witty and an intellectual from East Germany, said, no, technically correct. Cathedrals are too big for bulldozers. Stalin and Ulbricht used dynamite to bring them down. And how many holes in the ground I've looked at in Russia and in Eastern Europe that were caused by the bulldozing of such things. Now, there's all kinds of argument as to how closely atheism as a philosophy and naturalism associated with it. But if you talk to the Russian friends, they'll point out two things to you. One, that for Marx, the criticism of religion was central. It had to be done away with. And secondly, their analysis, using Dostoevsky, as I just mentioned, is, as one, it was a very moving experience. I was talking to a professor in the Academy of Sciences, and he said, you know what? He said, we thought that we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings, and we found out far too late we couldn't. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in the famous speech he made on coming to America, said, if I am asked to account for the deaths of 100 million of my fellow citizens, the short answer is we have forgotten God. I think we need to take seriously the analysis of the people there of this situation, rather than from the luxury of our own standpoint. So it raises back to Hume's question. Why does God allow suffering? Couldn't he have created us without the capacity of modern moral evil, and so on? Well, the short answer is, of course he could. That might surprise you, but think about it. We can make worlds like that. They're called robotic worlds. We can create worlds in which there's neither good nor evil. They're amoral. They are robotic. But you see, when we say couldn't have God have made a world like that, it seems to be quite clear there would have been no humans in it. We're wishing ourselves out of existence. Because an essential part of being human is the capacity to love. The capacity to say yes. And if you're going to have a real capacity to say yes, you've a capacity to say no. And love is rendered utterly impossible if you are a predetermined automaton. It's linked with the possession of what we call free will. Now that's a huge topic. Our will is not unlimited and so on. But it seems to me to be an absolute essential for humans to exist, that we have this capacity to say yes or no. And God could have removed it, or never even bothered with it, by creating us as machines, doing what we are programmed to do. That would have been a tragedy. I'm totally sure, that I would not like a robotic wife. When I arrive home in a couple of days' time and she comes to the door, and I see this iPad thing here, and I press the button marked kiss, and get a synthetic kiss. Well, you're laughing already. You don't like the idea. But it would be a perfect world. But then there would be no morality in it, no ethics in it, no love in it, none of the things that we count valuable. And Jean-Paul Sartre, of all people, expressed this very poignantly. The man who wants to be loved does not want to possess an automaton. And if we want to humiliate him, we need only try to persuade him that the beloved's passion is the result of a psychological determinism. If the beloved is transformed into an automaton, the lover finds himself alone. Now, a moment's reflection shows us that creating beings with real powers of choice is risky. But those of us who are parents must know that. Did you think about the risk you took in having children? I can remember holding the first baby in my hands, tiny little thing, little girl. But I can remember thinking, you could grow up to reject me. True, isn't it? In fact, many of us sitting in this audience are hurting tonight because of that has happened in different directions, hasn't it? Why have children then? Well, you know why, don't you? You think it's worth the risk of having the opportunity of bringing up little lives and nurturing them and experience the richness of love and friendship and family life that you couldn't have if you were bringing up a group of machines. Sometimes you might wish it, mind you, but that's another matter. Now, this is important if we take a risk, and it's so obvious we do, then you can maybe begin to understand at a higher level that God has similarly taken a risk. So, to sum that little bit up, if we wish for a world in which evil and pain are impossible, we're wishing ourselves out of existence. Now, the free will argument, as this is often called, does not apply to natural disasters. They raise another raft of questions. Earthquakes, for instance. I happened to arrive in an unplanned way in New Zealand 2 days after the Christchurch earthquake, and I had to change every lecture and television and radio interview I gave. Earthquake, why? Was the thing on everybody's lips. In their book, Rare Earth, geologist Peter Ward, astronomer David Brownlee, both at the University of Washington, have a chapter entitled The Surprising Importance of Plate Tectonics. And the argument is that if the Earth's tectonic plates ceased to move, mass extinction of life on Earth would eventually ensue. Plate tectonics is essential for the formation of continents and the maintenance of the balance between the Earth, the mountains, and the sea. They act as a global thermostat by recycling chemicals crucial to maintaining a uniformly balanced level of carbon dioxide. They are responsible for maintaining water liquid for a period of roughly 4 billion years. They maintain the Earth's magnetic field that protects it from cosmic rays that would be fatal for life. And their conclusion is it may be that plate tectonics is a central requirement for life on a planet, and it's necessary for keeping the world supplied with water. That complicates things, doesn't it? The very mechanism that keeps us alive is the one that is responsible for catastrophes. Now, of course, the catastrophe is building houses on fault lines. That's not the fault of the plate tectonics. if we know where the fault lines are. But of course, many people do not. So that simply shows us how complex this is. There's a ring of fire around the Pacific, you're all aware of it, where earthquakes are likely to happen. But there's also a ring of fire in every one of us, isn't there? Where things can explode within our brain. A massive tumor, and we're gone. And there's the large and the small. And you will stop bothering about earthquakes if you suddenly get a brain tumor, because the personal impact of the pain takes over everything. So we've got to think about both the large and the small. So my question now is very real. Couldn't God have made a world where there were no plate tectonics? Could he have made a sun which heated but didn't burn? Could he have made electricity that wasn't dangerous? Could he have made an organic world without any bacteria or predation, and so on and so forth? Could God have X, Y, Z? And as an undergraduate and as an adult, how many hours have we spent in the night trying to sort that out? If God is all powerful and all good, well, shouldn't he have, couldn't he have, wouldn't he have? I just want to make a simple observation, ladies and gentlemen. I have never met anyone who has come to a good conclusion or a satisfactory conclusion by following that argument. Have you? Now, why is that? I think the answer is obvious. Because when we've argued it all through, we're faced with two cathedrals. We're faced with beauty and barbed wire. And we can't get it away from us. We're simply faced with them. It's ragged, and that's what's real. Now, I've been taught about asking questions, and if you keep asking a series of questions that get you going round in endless circles, it might be better to change the question. And so I do change the question. Granted that it's like that it's beauty and barbed wire. My question is there any evidence anywhere that there's a God that you could trust with it? That's a big one, isn't it? And my answer in the closing moments of my talk is this. It's not an answer, it's a way in, which I hope you might find worth thinking about. I think it's important at this point to listen before concluding that belief in God is inconsistent with the existence of evil and suffering, to listen to what the Christian claim is. It claims that Jesus Christ is God incarnate. And at the heart of his message, there is a cross. And if he is God, the obvious question, put slightly crudely but bluntly, is, if that's God, what's he doing on a cross? Well, surely it means, at the very least, that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has himself become part of it. A Christian is not a person who solved the problem of suffering and evil, but one who has come to love and trust a God who has suffered. Now that's only half the story, because if the suffering had been the end, we'd never have heard of it. But it was not the end, because the message that set Jerusalem buzzing that first Easter, and that riveted the philosophers at Athens later on when Paul told them, was that Jesus had conquered death and been resurrected. And their central message, ladies and gentlemen, was this, that there is to be a final judgment. The importance of it cannot be overestimated, because it addresses a further and final problem with the atheistic worldview, the problem of ultimate justice. We're all aware, sadly, that untold millions of human beings throughout history have suffered grievous injustice, and after lives of unrelenting misery have died without any redress whatsoever. They have received no justice in this life, and if atheism is true, there is no other life in which justice could be done. If there is no final judge, there is no ultimate justice. Justice is not an illusion, though. If this is true that Jesus rose from the dead, the abusers, terrorists, and evil men and women in the world will one day be brought to justice. I tried to make the point to Richard Dawkins on one occasion, and he said that the thing to do was work for justice in this world, with which, of course, I heartily agreed, but pointed out that that doesn't solve the problem, that most people will never, by definition, receive ultimate justice. Atheism has nothing to say at this point. Now, of course, there is a tendency among us humans to react to the concept of ultimate justice with something less than enthusiasm, because it raises the question of my ultimate position. I don't like a God like that, some say. And yet they protest at moral evil and say, God, you've got to intervene. So long as his intervention would not have him poking into my life, that's fine. Now, none of us can realistically discuss the problem of the world's evil as though we were simply spectators of a phenomenon that's completely extraneous to ourselves. G.K. Chesterton once wrote to a leading English newspaper in reply to the editor's request for letters answering the question, what's wrong with the world? And Chesterton's answer is famous. Dear sir, I am yours sincerely, G.K. Chesterton. He was honestly prepared to say openly what we know in our heart. There's evil in each of us. We're part of the problem. And atheist John Gray gives unexpected support. He said the cardinal need is to change the prevailing view of human beings, which sees them as inherently good creatures, unaccountably burdened with a history of violence and oppression. Here we reach the nub of realism and its chief stumbling point for prevailing opinion, its assertion of the innate defects of human beings. Nearly all pre-modern thinkers took it as given that human nature is fixed and flawed. And in this, as in some other ways, they were close to the truth of the matter. No theory of politics can be credible that assumes that human impulses are naturally benign, peaceable, or reasonable. Once we grasp this fact, a more realistic formulation of the problem of evil would be, I think and do evil. If then there is a God, why does he tolerate me? And in conclusion, the answer, according to Christianity, is, as Blaise Pascal discovered so many years ago, it lies in the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. You see, they do not simply give us a way in to the problem of pain and evil. They give us a resolution of the problem of justice. They show us what the name of Jesus means. He shall save his people from their sins because of his death and resurrection. Those who repent, the message says, of their own evil and contribution to human pain and suffering, receive forgiveness, peace with God, a new life with new powers, and the promise of a world where suffering and pain will be no more. C.S. Lewis once wrote words that are as opposite today as when he wrote them. A book on suffering, which says nothing about heaven, is leaving out almost the whole of one side of the account. Scripture and tradition habitually put the joys of heaven into the scale against the suffering of earth, and no solution of the problem of pain which does not do so can be called a Christian one. We are very shy nowadays of even mentioning heaven. We are afraid of the jeer about pie in the sky, but either there is pie in the sky or there isn't. If there isn't, Christianity is false, because this doctrine is woven into the whole of its fabric. If there is, then this truth, like any other, must be faced. And so must its implications. The pioneer Christian apostle Paul wrote, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that shall be revealed. For I am sure that neither death nor life, nor height nor depth, nor anything in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ our Lord." They're not the words of an armchair philosopher, but of a man who had seen and experienced life at its rough end, suffering frequent beatings to within an inch of death, imprisonment, deprivation, and hardship. At times I try to imagine what the glorious realm is like. And the question arises within me, if the veil that now separates the seen and the unseen world were to be parted for a moment, and I'm going to risk saying this, and we could see the present state of, say, the innocent children that have been battered to death since I started my lecture, if we could see beyond that veil that separates us from the eternal world, if we could see what God has done with them, it is just possible that all our concerns about God's capacity to handle the situation would dissolve and we would have no more questions. Thank you very much.